they really do, I think, want to be able to receive ballots that either don't have a postmark or, they just find a bunch of ballots while they're counting ballots, or they're okay with allowing postmasters and post office workers to use their own discretion to set the date on the postal marking equipment to something other than the actual date that that envelope was received in the mail.
Mail-in voting is becoming an increasingly heated topic, rightly so. This is an election year like we've never seen before. Here to give us his perspective on this issue and how he's been exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats in Congress is Congressman Thomas Massie. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Congressman Massie, not too long ago, you introduced, I think it was 3 amendments to the Democrats' so-called nonpartisan bill on mail-in voting. Can you tell us a little bit about the Democrats' bill, what they were trying to do, and what your amendments would have done to improve that piece of legislation?
Sure. I serve on the Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction over the post office. The Democrats sought to bring a bill forward. Really, it was a witch hunt. They were trying to make a political statement. They were going after the Postmaster General, who, by the way, President Trump didn't nominate. It was a bipartisan board of the post office. But they're trying to blame this on Trump. They're trying to say that President Trump's slowing down the election. So what they did, their bill, the main thing it would have done is to elevate the restrictions on political activity for the Postmaster General. They're saying that this Postmaster General, because he is a Republican and he supported Republicans in the past, that he's unqualified based on the things he's done in his private life to be the Postmaster General. So the First Amendment that I offered, and by the way, I forced them to take a roll call vote on 2 of these 3 amendments, and not to spoil the outcome, but they all failed, surprisingly, on party lines. And I say surprisingly, not ironically or not sarcastically, because these are amendments that are common sense amendments that should have passed. The first one that I offered, or the first one that I want to talk about here, said that if you are going to heighten the restrictions on political activity for the Postmaster General, why not apply that same constraint on all postmasters? There are 15,000 postmasters in the United States, and where most states have gone to mail-in ballots this year, and a lot of states have dissolved their precincts where you vote, the post offices have now become your precincts. And in most states, they're precinct observers or precinct watchers. The closest thing we have to that now is the postmaster in each of the post offices. So I said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to say that the Postmaster General can't engage in fundraising or political activity on his own personal time, then apply that to the postmasters. Well, the Democrats voted that down. So that was my First Amendment to that bill.
And what were your other amendments to the bill?
So another amendment I offered, they're worried about work slowdowns. They're saying that the Postmaster General has taken actions that have actually caused the mail to slow down. Never mind, he's only been on the job 60 days, and the data that they point to shows that the mail slowed down even before his money saving. He's actually from the private sector. He's trying to get the post office, not even to profitability, let's just make it break even, okay? So he tried to implement some things. The Democrats said, oh, the mail's going to be slowed down, the ballots won't get delivered on time. So the amendment that I offered was to make sure that organized labor doesn't slow down your ballot. The amendment said that if you picket at your job site and that causes ballots to be slowed down, you could be fired from your job. And this would only apply between now and when the electors deliver the results to Congress in January. So my bill would have sunset, my amendment would have sunset, and it would only apply to people who slow down the mail. I don't want to take away your First Amendment right to picket, but if you picket or strike or do an organized work slowdown, shouldn't you be able to be fired if you're in charge of delivering the ballots? Well, the Democrats said no. We want to let people that work at the post office form a picket line and possibly slow down the mail, even if it contains your ballot. To me, that seemed pretty hypocritical.
It's pretty concerning, too, when you think about that there was a postman that was taking down someone's Trump signs that was reported not too long ago. So the political activism of these postmen is very concerning. Potential political activism of the postman is indeed very concerning. You also introduced another amendment, Congressman Massie, with regards to potential forgeries of the dates and also resetting the dates with using postal equipment. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how the Democrats received that amendment proposal?
Yeah, this is probably the most important one that I offered. And I was frankly shocked at the Democrat response to this. Look, we've been told that this election may not be decided for weeks. And if we're going to have faith in our form of government, we need to make sure that no ballots are being cast while the ballots are being counted after the election has ended, after Election Day. Well, when you put the postmark on an envelope, that's basically a federal government guarantee. That's the imprimatur of the federal government saying that this ballot was cast on this date. And I went and looked at the statutes, at the federal statutes. Now, it's a crime punishable by 5 years to forge a postmark, okay? But it's not really clear if it's a forgery if you used postmark equipment, like and apply a real postmark and have backdated the postmark by manipulating the postmark equipment at the post office. So what my amendment sought to do was to clarify this ambiguity and to say that it is a crime to use official postmarking equipment at the post office, whether you're a postal employee, whether you're the postmaster, or whether you're somebody that sneaks into the post office and gains access to an official postmarking device, that the 5-year crime that applies to forging a postmark would also apply to somebody who's using postal equipment to make it a real postmark that's got the wrong date for the purposes of submitting a ballot after the election. Okay, that would seem like a no-brainer to make that also a federal crime.
Yeah, Congresswoman Maloney shot it down, didn't she?
Yeah, and ironically, it took weeks to decide her own election in New York, her primary election, because of the mail-in ballots. But she shot that down. She urged everybody to vote against my amendment. And in fact, you have some states, I believe, like Pennsylvania and Nevada, where they're already talking about not even requiring a postmark or a legible postmark on the envelopes. And I think that's dangerous. And I think it's particularly dangerous if postal workers are able to manipulate that equipment to affix a postmark after the election date that gives the imprimatur of the federal government, implying that that ballot was received before the election date, especially if we're still counting ballots.
And absolutely. It could potentially stop ballot stuffing. Did Chairman Maloney give you any reason, or any of the Democrats even afterwards, about why they voted against your common sense amendment?
No. If you go back and watch the hearing on C-SPAN, they were at a loss for words to explain their objection to this. They said it's not a problem. So
it's not a problem if a bunch of votes are just found after Election Day that weren't there before, and they supposedly have the date of right before the election. That's not a problem if all these votes come up in various post offices or warehouses.
Yeah, and they're saying it hasn't happened yet. Well, no, it hasn't happened yet.
Of course, the election hasn't happened yet.
The election hasn't happened yet, and the date of the election hasn't passed yet. But this really, I mean, think about it, what it means for them to oppose this. This gives you some insight into their thinking. They really do, I think, want to be able to receive ballots that either don't have a postmark, or they just find a bunch of ballots while they're counting ballots, or they're okay with allowing postmasters and post office workers to use their own discretion to set the date on the postal marking equipment to something other than the actual date that envelope was received in the mail, at the post office and then shipped. Most states, by the way, will accept In fact, Kentucky, the state that I represent this year, has decided to accept ballots that arrive up to 4 days after the election,
Wow.
as long as they are postmarked by the date of the
Oh,
election.
okay then.
So, but that's why it's so critical. If the election officials are going to count ballots after that arrive after the election, then the postmark really matters. And
Absolutely.
I hate to make another federal crime, right? I'm more libertarian leaning, and I don't want more federal crimes. There are really only 3 federal crimes in the Constitution, but one of those is counterfeiting.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more from Congressman Thomas Massie. We're back again with Congressman Thomas Massie. Congressman, let's talk about the Supreme Court. So, late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, of course, recently, and President Trump is going to name his potential replacement for her likely on Saturday. What are your thoughts of some of the replacement names that have been floating around, like Amy Barrett or Barbara Lagoa, Florida, and maybe some other ones that Trump is probably considering?
Well, I'm told they're great candidates, but we've been told that before on some of these Republican appointments, and then we get disappointed a few years down the road. I think to really understand who is the best candidate, you're going to have to go back and read everything they've written. Look at how their jurisprudence has evolved over their career. Look at the trajectory of their rulings. Have they started gone in a certain direction? So until somebody reads all of their opinions and even other things they've written, I think it's going to be hard to say. So I wouldn't want to vouch for any of them, frankly. We've had such a bad track record in the last 40 years as Republicans naming people. Although I will say this, one of my litmus tests is the Second Amendment. And in the absence of being able to read all of the opinions, I like to focus on opinions and views that are expressed on the Second Amendment, and that really informs me on some of those. And I think these candidates are good on the Second Amendment.
So, if we had President Thomas Massie in the White House, who do you think he would nominate on his short list?
I would give serious consideration to Senator Mike Lee. He's a person that I know and have had a lot of discussions about constitutional issues. And he thinks very deeply about these things. And on a lot of issues, we see eye to eye. So that would be one of my choices. Another one would be Judge Napolitano. He's an actual judge, and he's opined on a lot of cases, even in the lower courts. And I like the way he thinks on judicial issues. I had the opportunity to have breakfast with Antonin Scalia a couple years before he passed away. And I was just fascinated by how he had already thought through all of these issues. He was invited, by the way, by Steve King, Representative Steve King, to speak to, about a dozen of us. And the topic that Representative King asked him to speak to was restoring the constitutional balance of government. And after Scalia finished his bacon, and eggs and this fine breakfast, he picked up the topic of the paper, the flyer advertising the breakfast, and said, "I'm not going to speak to this. This is not my job." He said, "You have all the tools you need to restore the constitutional balance of government right there in the Constitution. You're the strongest branch." And one of my colleagues, who's no longer here in Congress, protested. He said, but impeachment's so unwieldy. By the way, you got to remember, Obama was the president at the time. Impeachment is so unwieldy, it's practically undeployable politically. And Scalia laughed indignantly and said, "I'm not talking about impeachment. You guys have the power of the purse. Everything you complain about, you turn around and fund. You are the strongest branch of government, and if you would just quit funding all of this stuff, then it wouldn't happen." And so Scalia got it on that point. He was right about that. And I think that this Supreme Court nomination wouldn't be so important the right and the left especially, who are going apoplectic over this. And the president is within his constitutional authority.
Absolutely. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives him the power to nominate a Supreme Court nominee with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. And as Ginsburg herself said back in 2016, with regard to the situation with Scalia's passing under President Obama, he's still the president. And that same, why don't we apply the Ginsburg standard of 2016 here in 2020? Trump is still the president, or the president is still the president, rather.
Yeah, and the left wouldn't be so apoplectic if we hadn't let the Supreme Court take over our jobs of legislating. Like the Supreme Court, because they are now a super legislature with life terms and no review of their decisions, who issue rulings that become basically the rule of law, and then sometimes just basically making up laws. For instance, on same-sex marriage, overturning laws and creating laws out of thin air. If it weren't for the power that we've allowed them to have through the abdication of our own power, this wouldn't be such a divisive issue, and it would just be a thing that happens.
So some of your colleagues in the House, like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, in one of her video chats on social media, suggested that nothing would be off the table if Trump gets his nominee in, and if the Democrats, of course, keep the House, take the Senate, and potentially take the White House, just hypothetically. She said nothing would be off the table, including the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And even Senator Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, has suggested that could be a potential come 2021 if they have the Senate and the presidency with Biden. What are your thoughts about the Democrats packing the court like FDR tried to do, only this time putting their preferred judges in 2021 if they have the power to do so?
Well, first off, I haven't seen any of them say they won't pack the court if the president doesn't nominate and the Senate doesn't confirm another Supreme Court justice. So it's not an idle threat. It's not blackmail. It's not an offer. It's a campaign promise that they're making. I mean, they're literally saying, elect us and we'll do this regardless of what the president does with respect to this nomination. I think it's really dangerous to overturn 150 years of precedents this lightly. It's sort of like when Harry Reid undid the 60-vote rule for nominations, and then Senator McDonald had he basically had the justification to do the same thing for Supreme Court nominees. It's sort of a race to the bottom. Although I want to throw this out there. If you're thinking about changing the number of Supreme Court justices and you're worried about the amount of power they have, why not make it an even number? Because what happens if they tie is the lower court ruling stands. And except for the fact that some of the lower court rulings have been misconstrued and injunctions have been misconstrued to apply to the whole United States, which they shouldn't. They should be only within their jurisdiction. If you took care of that fact, that they were limited to their own jurisdiction, their own districts, then I'd like to see an even number of Supreme Court justices. Maybe go down to 8, and keep it at 8. Maybe we should do that this year.
Or go back to the original number of 6 or 5.
6. They started with 6, right? 6 was a good number. If you have a tie, then let's respect the lower court rulings. And by the way, on a lot of these decisions like Heller, the lower courts have ignored D.C. versus Heller. They're just ignoring the Supreme Court ruling. So anyways, I'm just throwing that out there. And I doubt anybody's going to take my advice on that. If they do vote to increase the number of justices, if they do put that on the floor, and I presume I would still be here in Congress. I've got a re-election, but I feel pretty confident about that. I will vote no on that.
Okay, thank you so much, Thomas Massie. We're glad to have you today on the show with us.